The thing that I always really like to hear from young people is when they co-create something with someone or with a group of people, because it's the agency they have over something and the pride that they feel and how empowered they feel when they have created something.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of From the Magic Pencil, Voices of Writing Through. I am especially happy to be speaking today with Jess Blackledge, who used to be our deputy director, but now is off doing all sorts of things. Spoke to her during the first season, and now her life has changed yet again. And I'm really curious to see what she's doing and to get her thoughts on some of these issues surrounding what it means to be creative. So hi, Jess.
Hi, thanks for having me back.
Our pleasure. So why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, what you're doing, and what your life is like right now?
As you said, I used to work for Writing Through, and then I moved back to the UK, and I was working for a theatre for a while down south in Plymouth on a big performance and playwriting project for children and schools. And now I live in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and I work for the Edinburgh Festival Fringe, and I work for the organisation charity behind the Fringe called the Fringe Society, which sort of underpins and organises the entire festival. I always assume that people are going to know what the Fringe is, but not everybody does. So in case people don't, it's one of the world's biggest arts festivals. It's an open access festival, which means anybody can perform. Anyone can be an artist. It's not curated, it's not programmed. This year there are over 3,000 shows. It happens across Edinburgh in all various venues. Anything can be a venue. Anybody can perform. It's all sorts of things: theatre, music, comedy, spoken word, circus, all sorts of things. And my role is in the community access, engagement and learning department, and my role specifically is with the learning part of things. So I am responsible for everything to do with schools and young people and teachers. So I create lots of different projects across the year. People always say to me, is that a full-time job? Are you working for the festival all year round? And it does take a full year to organize the festival, but also a lot of the work I do is throughout the year, sending artists into schools, having various projects with teachers, and kind of engaging schools and young people and making the festival more accessible for them.
It's amazing. And the artists who come, they're from all over the world, right? They're not just from the UK.
Yeah, fully international. In fact, there's a lot of international people, yeah.
And the festival itself takes place during the summer, right?
During August, yeah, for the whole of August.
It's amazing. I've been before. It is wild. It's totally wild, but so much fun.
Yeah, it's a very intense month, as I learned last year. I started in my role 2 weeks before the Fringe, which was a really stressful time to start, but so much fun. I've been many times before as well. That was what we kind of did as my family holiday when I was growing up. We always came up to the Fringe every year when I was a teenager, so I remember it. But it's been, I was living in Asia for all that time. It's been about 20 years since I've been, and so to be back here and now working for them is kind of like full circle, and working to help young people do this, which was what that was what I was. I was a young person wanting to perform at the Fringe and wanting to go and see things at the Fringe. So it feels especially poignant for me.
Yeah, and that's really interesting because the trajectory of your career and your life, which started with you really wanting, like you said, to do some performance. You've done a lot of work in photography. You moved to Korea, you moved to Cambodia, you've done all sorts of things. You come back, now you're doing that. How do you see a thread that goes through that?
Yeah, I guess so. It's funny because I sort of I did my degree in drama and theatre studies and spent my entire childhood and up until my early 20s when I moved to Asia in performance in the theatre. I loved performing, I loved working in the theatre, anything to do with the theatre. And then I sort of moved away from it, even though I feel like all the skills I developed from that were relevant in every job I've ever had since, and lots of other parts of life. I sort of moved away from it, and now I've come back to it, and I'm kind of like, as much as I loved everything that I've done, I don't know why I ever moved away from it, because I really feel like that's what I want to do. I'm reminded now that, like, yeah, I want to be working in the theatre. I don't know if I want to work in festivals forever, because there's not very many people who run this whole operation, and it's such a big thing, so everybody has to be very hardworking. They're all great, but they don't all have arts backgrounds, because there's a big marketing team and there's a big kind of commercial side to the Fringe as well, and there's lots of people in box office, there's lots of people in various sort of parts of the industry, and the part I'm interested in is accessibility of the art and engagement of the art, specifically for young people, which in a way is kind of niche. Like, I'm working for a festival, I never thought I would do that, and before this I was working for a theatre, so I feel like it can be applied everywhere. But even, you know, I was doing that not really for performance, but I was doing that with writing through for young people in a different way, in creative writing. So yeah, I suppose there is sort of a through line of it all, but who knows where I'll end up. Sorry.
Could you talk a little bit more about this idea of accessibility, what you mean by that, and also why you think it's important?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work at the moment is about addressing the barriers that young people face in coming to the Fringe, and there are a lot. And not only young people, but our team also focuses on community groups of various different demographics and all the barriers that people face. First of all, very obvious things if you've been to Edinburgh, which is that Edinburgh is not a physically accessible city at all. It's very hilly, it's very cobbled streets, the buildings are very old, and it's beautiful, but it's not accessible for physically for people. So there's that. There's also lots of barriers, obviously, like we're in a massive cost of living crisis, and which is only getting worse in the UK at the moment. And a lot of the young people that I work with and the schools are in areas of multiple deprivation, and some of them are 10 minutes on the bus from the city centre, and they don't know what the Fringe is or have never been to the Fringe. Well, at first I thought that was really shocking, but actually, you know, if you don't really leave your community, and if it's quite a generational thing to sort of be brought up in a certain way and not really have much access to the arts and not really have any reason to go to the Fringe or to know what it is, then why would you? So a lot of the work that I do is around advocacy of the festival and making more young people aware of what it is. And then, you know, there's things like making the festival a bit more accessible for disabled people in various different ways, different disabilities, for neurodivergent people. But there's various different schemes and programs for, we have these things called sensory backpacks, which are full of all these kind of sensory toys and things that we give out to anybody who is finding the festival environment quite overwhelming, because it can be. It's very busy and chaotic in the city centre. But mostly what I'm interested in is young people who really don't know much about any of this stuff, and giving them exposure and experience of the arts so that they then get an interest. And the good thing about the Fringe, as opposed to the other festivals, because Edinburgh has lots of festivals, is that we do everything. There's no kind of one specific thing. So for young people who have a big kind of broad range of interests, they might be interested in music but not be interested in theatre. That's fine, because we do both, or various things. And I've recently started a project called the Young Fringe Ambassadors, and these are a small group of representatives, 12 to 15-year-olds from some schools that we work with, high schools, and they are young people who are interested in the arts, but they don't necessarily, some of them do, but they don't necessarily want to perform. And this project was sort of came off the back of me having conversations with some of the young people last year and going to see shows with them at the Fringe and chatting to them and saying, like, do you think that this is for you? Will you be up on stage one day? And them saying, oh, no, like the arts is not for me, because I'm way too shy, I'm way too anxious, I don't want to be up there. They have no idea that there are other career pathways into the arts, and there are a million other jobs that don't include getting up on stage. So I created this project, which basically we meet every month and we take them to a different Fringe venue every month. And they've been to the Edinburgh Playhouse, which is a big theatre, and they got to go backstage and have a talk with their technical team. They got to go up on the fly rigs, which was really cool. They got to stand on the stage and they got to have a chat with the marketing team. We took them to a show at one of the theatres. They had a chat with the cast afterwards. We're having a programming workshop. They're going to come to the Fringe and speak to our artist services team and learn about how to bring a show to the Fringe. So they're kind of learning all the different aspects of the industry and figuring out what they like. We have one young girl who's really interested in costume design. We have a couple of people who want to perform. We have someone who's really interested in technical things. And the good thing about meeting industry professionals is that some of them, like the technical manager at one of the theatres we went to, he got into that by training as an electrician, and another member of the team got into it via university. And so there's all this different ways you can move into the industry. And I feel like young people don't have enough information about that. Maybe how are they supposed to make their decisions when they leave school if they don't have all that information? So that's all kind of a part of making the arts a bit more accessible and giving them ideas of what their options might be.
When you said that some of them say the arts are not for me, that really struck a chord, because there are two ways of thinking about it. One is, of course, I need to get a job. How can I work in the arts and have it support me? And the other is being creative and being involved in the arts can be, and for most people, is separate from what they do to make a living. And why is it still important? And I know when I've been speaking to some people in Cambodia, the importance of the marketability of what you do artistically is seen in a completely different way. It's not about that. But in the West, certainly in the US and the UK, everything is geared towards what kind of job can I get?
I find it very difficult, honestly, to, in this current climate, this economic climate, to tell people that it's going to be a really beneficial thing to work in the arts, like financially, I mean, and, you know, like for sustainably and to be stable, because it's hard. And I don't blame anyone for thinking that they need to go down a different path because times are hard. Like, I really do think that that's a very difficult thing. Like the job that I do, people would say like I wouldn't really class myself as an artist, like maybe in other parts of my life, but my job, I'm not an artist. I work with artists and I facilitate programs with artists. I think that my job is very creative, but I'm creating projects and programs and interesting things for young people to do and schools to do and teachers to do, which is a very creative thing. And I think, you know, you can be creative in many other ways, which doesn't require creating pieces of art in the traditional way that people might see that is creativity. For me, it's an important thing for young people to know that there are ways of being creative in your job that don't mean you have to be a struggling freelance artist, as much as freelance artists are very much needed. But also I get why people would be put off the industry as well, because it's not funded well enough in this country and probably in any country, and it's, you know, it's not appreciated as much as it could be. And also since the pandemic, it's only got worse. Every arts organization in the UK is struggling. No one is really thriving as well as they could be. So I get why it's hard, definitely, but I think there's a bit of perspective to look at it as well. And like you said, there's different ways of being creative. It doesn't have to be a job. Like some of our young people, they're musicians. One young girl, she plays the trumpet, and she had an audition recently at the Royal Conservatoire, which is in Glasgow, and that's a very prestigious school and it's great. But, you know, I hope that she does well with that and goes there if she wants to, but also I hope that if she doesn't, she continues to play, and maybe, you know, maybe she wants to perform at the Fringe one day. The Fringe, for a very small number of people, makes them successful, and lots of big names have come out of the Fringe, especially comedians and actors. But for the majority of people, it's just a chance to perform at a big festival, and most people barely break even. Most people lose money coming to the Fringe. It's a difficult thing, but it's a thing that people really want to do because it's about performing or creating something, not necessarily performing, producing, or yeah.
Yeah, it makes me think about what we have often talked about, which is how working in the arts and being creative, and whatever that means, those are transferable skills, right? So you develop skills by your experience of working in the arts and by learning how to tap into that creativity. And those skills then can be transferred to anything. I look at you and I think of you as one of the people I know who has lived a very creative life. But what I mean by that is that you have taken your ability to be creative and put it onto your life and applied that to a lot of different decisions you've made over the years of what you're interested in, where you're going, what you're doing, moving here, moving there, moving back, all of that. So do you see yourself as someone who lives a creative life?
I think because of the sort of societal definition of creativity, which we have to question, like I was just talking about, like because of the way people talk about being creative, I don't feel like I'm creative as much as I would like to be. But then if I think about it, like you just said, I am creative in the way that I have lived my life, and it doesn't have to be in the traditional way. But just like everything, we kind of get a little bit indoctrinated by the world and the way that the world defines things. So if I just think about it day to day, I probably would say I'm not as creative as I would like to be, because I'm not creating as much art as I would like to, or doing things for myself, projects. Like, I'm not an artist for a living. I'm not much of an artist in my free time at the moment. So like, I would like to do more of that. And that is sort of the way that I think we traditionally think of creativity. But if I analyze it a little bit, I would say, yeah, like I absolutely am. And I think everybody is creative or has the ability to be. And yeah, it sort of depends on your definition of creativity. But I also think that it sort of waxes and wanes a little bit. I can be more creative at certain times and less at other times.
It's reminding me of a conversation that I had very recently, one of the episodes of the podcast with Dara Hoyt, who helps run the Far Circus in Cambodia. And when I asked him that question, he talked about how every act that we do, what we decide to cook, what we decide to wear, every decision is a creative decision because it's a choice. And I wonder also whether this is, I know not everything is a cultural thing, but whether this is a kind of a division between a Western and an Eastern philosophy. You've lived in both and worked in both. What do you think about that?
There's something about the acts that we do every day, which we don't necessarily appreciate. We don't think about them. We just do them because we have to get through life. There's a very kind of capitalist idea behind it, I think, that we have to get up and we have to get dressed and we have to get something to eat and we have to go to work and we have to do all these things. We can be creative in all of those decisions, but I think it's difficult to focus on that because of sort of the stresses and pressures of life. Life is hard for a lot of people, and so there's a necessity behind things. And even more so in Cambodia, there's a necessity behind a lot of things, but the attitude in Cambodia towards things is very different. And I don't really want to speak for any Cambodian people, but I would say, in my experience, there's more of an attitude of you have to do these things, but that's life and you kind of get on with it, and there's not too much pushback against it.
There's a lot of research in the West that has been going on. A lot of books are now being written and published about the effect, the neurological and the biological effect of experiencing art on the brain. And that could even mean taking a walk in the woods in nature and really looking, really slowing down and looking. That in itself is a creative thought process, and it changes the brain. It lights up different parts of the brain and produces things like serotonin, all of that. That is true. We are in a different state of mind. And I think that that is a state of mind that is closer to the surface, maybe in Asia or in Cambodia. And maybe, certainly in Cambodia, maybe it's out of necessity. How do you survive? How did they survive the tragedy and even the difficulties that come with a post-tragedy generation, unless you find a way to get that joyous feeling that comes with creativity and applying it to your life. Maybe it's also a little bit of Buddhism. I don't know.
Yeah, I was going to say, in Buddhist cultures, there's a lot more focus on being present, the whole kind of concept of mindfulness, about being in the moment and focusing on the thing that you're doing or one thing in your vicinity. It's supposed to like increase your serotonin and things like that. And that is what creating something, being creative, can do as well, I think. Like if you're creating a piece of work or a piece of art, and even though it can be about multiple things, it's often one concept you're focusing on. If you're really engrossed in it, you can't be thinking about the future or the past. You're sort of there in the moment.
And they find that even if you're looking at a painting, not having created, you're just looking at it, and you have that experience of really seeing a painting that speaks to you, quote unquote, that you have that same exact reaction in your brain that you would if you were actually standing there with the brush. And so the idea of creativity is embedded in us in some ways. Also makes me wonder, how do you react when somebody says, oh, I'm not creative? Like when the student said, well, the arts aren't for me. But separating out having to make a living by making art, whatever that means, from being a creative person. How do you respond to that?
I think that it's a sort of common misconception that creativity can't be cultivated and that it's an innate thing. I think that creativity can be developed over time. We all change as we go through life into completely different people. And like I was saying, your creativity can wax and wane, and you can go and learn a skill or something. You can learn about something that can inspire your creativity and sort of awaken something in you, I think. And I think that because of people's circumstances and the lack of accessibility towards certain things, people are told by the world that they're not creative because they're told things aren't for them, or they just have never heard of things, or they just don't have access to things, or their priorities are different because they don't see the benefits. Lots of schools in the UK are great, but there are also lots of schools which really don't focus a lot on the arts because there is this kind of mindset for a lot of people that the arts are less important than more academic subjects, which are going to get you into various different lines of work. So if you've grown up in an environment where people are telling you that, you're going to think that that's less important, and therefore you're not going to really engage with it through your life. And then you're going to think it's not for you, because why would it be? I was extremely lucky to have a whole childhood full of the arts because both my school and my family really encouraged that. I wouldn't be in this job if I didn't have that, and I wouldn't have had this whole trajectory if I hadn't had that support. But so many people don't have that, and I think it's way more common to not have that. And so I think if people are saying they're not creative, it's just because they don't know they're creative. And being creative is not only one thing. It's about being curious and asking questions. I mean, it can be a million different things in every different industry, in every different school subject, in every different interest that people have, in every different personality trait. There can be levels of creativity in all of that. It's not one thing. So yeah, of course people think they're not creative because maybe they've been told their whole life they're not, or they just don't know anything about it. That's why I'm interested in more exposure for young people and more experience, because if they think they're not creative, then I'm going to show them that they are. That's my goal.
That's wonderful. And I love the way you say that creativity can be cultivated. It can be allowed. People need to be given the permission to say, oh, I can access or use that creative part of me, which is there. People like us are looking to cultivate in them, and then their life becomes different. Not that they're necessarily going to go out and become musicians or painters or actors, but the way that they approach their lives are different. Yeah, it's fascinating. So why do people need to be creative? Why do people need to be able to have that permission and cultivate their creativity? Why is that important?
I think there's so many reasons why. In my own experience, I think when I was a child and a teenager, I spent a big portion of my youth going to a youth theatre. It was the biggest thing in my life. I made a lot of friends from it, and there was a lot of social skills, and it built up my confidence and things. I really attribute a lot of things to that, which is really why I want to work with young people like that are so impressionable from those sort of projects, because it taught me kind of teamwork and really a level of professionalism. Because when you're creating pieces of theatre or pieces of anything that have to be shown to an audience, you have to do it. You've got a date that this is going to go out, and you have to stand up in front of people and do something, or you have to be behind the scenes doing something. In one way or another, it has to go on. So things like deadlines, learning lines, learning cues, and pulling a project together as a team. I feel like from a really young age, I have this level of professionalism to the point where I'd go to this youth theatre, which was quite a big, intense youth theatre. It was quite strict. And then I'd go to school and we'd do our school plays, and I'd get really frustrated with everyone because it was so amateur. And I was just the 12-year-old telling everyone how it was supposed to be done. Things like that, I think, was just really important in my own sort of development, but also skills that we would always talk about writing through as well. Things like problem solving, risk taking, critical thinking, all of those things. They don't need to lead into a career in the arts, but having an outlet for things in terms of people's mental health, mental well-being, now that we can have a bit more vocabulary and a bit more discourse around it, we can say that it's so important to have some kind of creative outlet when it's not always easy for people to talk about things. People don't always have the means to have a therapist. That's not accessible for everybody. There are certain cultures which you just don't talk about things because where it's just not the done thing. And even, just different sort of dynamics in friendship groups or in families, cultures, communities, having some kind of outlet, whether that's writing or drawing or playing an instrument, or it doesn't even need to necessarily, I suppose, be an art form, but if you're creating something, building something, learning a skill which is more practical, if you're making something, you're putting your own creativity into something, there's something about it being a focus on something. The thing that I always really like to hear from young people is when they co-create something with someone or with a group of people, because it's the agency they have over something and the pride that they feel and how empowered they feel when they have created something, like at Writing Through, when you've created your own poem, even if it's 3 lines long. If you've never done that before, that's amazing. It's a feeling. And if you can feel pride at a young age in something like that, that's going to inspire you to go on to do many more things like that. Why wouldn't it? If you can do that, you can kind of do anything. That's sort of the way that I see it.
It's fantastic. It all goes to self-esteem and development of self-esteem. And when I think about you maybe coming out of college, having the confidence to look at the world in a different way than other people might and say, you know what? Yeah, I'm going to move to the other end of the world, and I'm going to not just go on a trip, I'm going to move. And I'm going to work in South Korea. And that takes imagination. And that also takes a lot of confidence. So I can see how, as you describe it, all the work that you did in that youth drama camp helped to instill that in you.
Yeah, definitely. I really attribute so much to that. And I was very lucky to be able to go to something like that, and that I grew up in a place that offered that, and that my parents could pay for me to do that. So many people don't have that access. I just think it's so important for so many things. I wouldn't be in this industry for sure, but I also wouldn't have moved abroad. I wouldn't have done the degree that I did. I wouldn't have the confidence to do a lot of things in life, or just to be the person that I am. And to start it from an early age, like I can see it with my nephew and nieces, and they're all under 8, but they're all doing drama and dance and music and things. You can see them growing in confidence and their personalities changing because they're coming into themselves and they're proud. And being proud of something is, I think, a really important thing, because you have that feeling where you know what it is to create something. So then you want to continue that through life.
Right. And we often think about childhood as a time of imagination. That's what everybody says. But shouldn't we always be using our imagination? I mean, that really goes hand in hand with creativity, doesn't it? And I think as adults, we talk about doing creative things or doing art, but we don't necessarily talk about imagination that much.
Yeah, And I think, again, that sort of comes down to the way that we live our everyday lives. There's a lot of expectations, and societally, the way that we have created this a 9 to 5 culture, and we have all these things that we do, like we eat at certain times and we eat certain things, and we do things at weekends that we only do at weekends, and we go to bed at certain times, and all this just way that we live our life. We don't have to do that, but we do. It's very difficult to not do that, because there's lots of things in life that sort of dictate how you live. Sometimes it's very difficult to use your imagination because of the way the world is set up.
And because we have that inner critic.
Yeah.
That we talk about a lot. And we all have that inner critic, which comes from living in a real world and how we grow up and what we see around us all the time. But how do you deal with that inner critic yourself?
I don't know. I feel like I struggle. I feel like everyone struggles. Some people are really good at pretending they don't. I think I'm quite good at pretending I don't struggle. I've got a degree in acting, so I can lie. Yeah, I don't know. I think it depends on your goal, and it depends what you're doing. If I'm creating something for other people's consumption, then their approval means far more, and then my inner critic is way worse. But if it's just for myself, which I think I'm getting better at, I think getting the benefits from that, I think has taken me a really long time. It's still not quite there, but like taken me a really long time to appreciate. And I think that's the same with a lot of us, I think, because again, the world is set up to tell us that everything that we do must have a purpose, which is coming back to us. You know, everything we do must be money driven, or must be for our own benefit in a way that's going to serve us more than just what's the feeling I'm going to get when I do this, or how might this serve me in the immediate present moment. And so, yeah, your inner critic is always there, because you're thinking, well, if I do this, who's going to see it? And what are they going to think? And who's better than me at this? And there's a lot of comparison that goes on in the world, and always is. And especially these days when the world is smaller and social media is everywhere, and you're able to see everyone's work and everyone's life all the time. It's very difficult to not compare yourself to people. I don't have the answer as to what you do
I
about
don't think anybody does. It's really hard. I know a lot of people who don't want to try new things because they won't be good at it. Like, you know, why should I try to bake bread? It's really hard. And I know my first loaf is going to be horrible. But that's kind of the joy of it, isn't it? I guess it goes back to giving yourself permission to use that creativity in whatever way kind of tickles your fancy at the moment.
Yeah, and I think also another thing is realizing that not everything is supposed to be easy. I think sometimes people don't do things because they're too hard, and I'm definitely guilty of that.
A very good point.
Like, I really want to get into knitting, and I can knit, and I can knit a scarf, and that's my best. And my mom is so good at knitting, and she makes very complicated things, and I would love to be at that level. But first of all, there's the inner critic telling me, well, you're never going to be as good as her, so what's the point? And then there's the inner critic saying, oh, but it's so hard. Every time I try and do a complicated pattern, it's too difficult, so I just give up. But it's supposed to be difficult, because then when you achieve it, it's more of an achievement because you've worked harder. But I just stick to the easy things because I don't want to tackle the difficult things.
Yeah, but we also only have so much energy, right? And so much of our energy goes towards what we have to do during the day, which includes our work or our school or so. At the end of the day, you know, that's why a lot of people just sit on their phones or iPads and they play games, and games that are easy.
Yeah.
There's a topic. What do you think, especially since you're working with younger people, do you see a problem between the use of games and phones and just all of the electronics that are in your face all the time now, especially with kids and their access to all that, whether that's limiting creativity or maybe it's increasing it?
I don't know. I mean, I can see it from both sides, just in my sort of anecdotal experience. Like, absolutely, people, including myself, people's attention spans are getting shorter because of all the very quick flash images and text that we're seeing all the time. everything is cut down to bite-sized chunks because people can't concentrate or just don't have to anymore, which I think is a massive problem. Some of the best pieces of work are things that you need to concentrate on for long periods of time, like films. And so I do think things like that could be stifling in creativity in terms of consuming creativity or creating it, I suppose. But there's so much good art on the internet. There's so much good creative pieces of work, and young people or anyone wouldn't have access to if it weren't for the internet, and it weren't for everyone having a phone now. So there's both sides to it, but I don't know. I don't know where it'll end up. What do you think?
Well, reminds me of, now maybe this is 15 years ago, an exhibit at the Royal Academy in London. It was David Hockney, and he had done all these paintings on his iPad. And it was the first time that I'd ever seen that. And they were absolutely gorgeous. And I was really blown away by them and really moved by it, the vibrancy and what he was able to do. And it was the first time I started to think, these are tools. And maybe it's like, any new tool. And in some ways, we're still in the generation of just developing all of this. These are tools that we can use if we harness them and think of them as tools and not think of them as kind of taking over our lives.
Yeah. The problem is that they're addictive and not always used in the right way.
That's right. But then to be on the other side, and it's funny that I'm taking the other side, when I think about photography and the photographs that people take on their phones, and they can crop them and they could do filters, they could do all of this stuff, which maybe doesn't require the technical prowess that you would need if you were using a camera. It allows more people to look at their surroundings in different ways and capture what they're seeing and what they're feeling. And you go on Instagram and people just have incredible photographs. And that's because of the phones, but also there's the accessibility issue as well, right?
Yeah.
Everyone has phones now, and so everybody can do that.
I'd like to know what a photographer thinks of that. I mean, it makes it much more accessible, which is great, because photography is, or used to be, at least with professional kind of equipment, used to be a really expensive thing to go into. But I wonder if photographers feel like something's being taken away from them by everyone now having this access.
I'm sure that they would feel that way to a certain extent. But then again, that's our kind of Western approach to it, to say, well, you have to be the best, you have to be the most technically adept or the most skilled. And those people who are, they do it as either they're photojournalists or they're artists or whatever. That's a whole different level. But for those of us who aren't that skilled in that way, we could still tap into our creativity through photography without having to have years and years of experience and techniques, and still get something out of it. Okay, we're not going to sell it to, the London Times and get money for the photo or have an exhibition, but we can get great pleasure from the experience ourselves and the experience of sharing it with our friends and our family.
Yeah. Which is great, because it does make it more accessible, and it makes it less elitist and makes things more accessible for more people.
And it might make us stop and slow down a little bit to actually look at something, to experience something. And you were talking about focus before. A lens will certainly focus, and you have to choose what is that spot that you're focusing on. Might help us in that way.
Yeah, true. But there is that thing of a lot of musicians and musical artists are now banning phones at their concerts because they don't feel like people are really experiencing the music. Everybody's filming the whole thing now, and no one's actually really in the moment with the music. They're just hoping to get the best video.
I remember, back in my day, when a record would come out and you would sit with your friend and you would play the record on the record player and listen to the whole thing. And you wouldn't do anything else. You would just sit there in the room.
Yeah.
And I don't know if people do that anymore. I certainly don't, and that's kind of like a loss.
Yeah. Because everything's more accessible, you can do a million things at once, which is again why our attention spans are shorter. Because, I listen to music whilst I'm doing about 5 other things, and because everything's so immediate and, everything's immediate gratification. I don't feel like I have the time to just sit and listen to music, because when am I going to do my cleaning or my cooking, or, like it's just everyday life. But yeah, I probably do have time to do that. And the benefits would probably be way better if I did do that. And I'd probably get way more out of the music.
Well, it's, these conversations that I've been lucky to have with people like you about creativity and the meaning of creativity and living a creative life. These conversations are taking us in all sorts of directions and making us think about all sorts of things and making us stop, right? And say, well, what do I think about that? I love it. It's really a gift to be able to do that. Well, maybe on that note, we should sign off, and I'll take this time to thank you again so very much. It's really fun that I get to see you again after all those years of working together and have these kind of long conversations with each other and to hear your perspectives. And, well done in everything that you're doing. It's great.
Thanks for having me. It's always great. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I didn't know I thought that. I just need to talk to get it out.
It's very creative of you. Yeah. Okay, thanks again, and hope to see you soon.
All right, thank you.
Next month, I am joined by a brilliant member of our board of directors, Ms. Botai Chiu. She and I discuss her experience as a Cambodian American, how important it is to give yourself the freedom to be creative, how she brings her creativity into every aspect of her life and encourages others to do the same. She gave me so much to think about, and I know she'll do the same for you. Here's a little clip to whet your appetite.
Creativity is open. It's not a closed concept, and it really can be anything. So focusing on where you feel the best, what makes you feel good when you do it, I think that's your genius. And I think that's where you need to shine more light on, spend more time on, and allow yourself the freedom to explore.